Hello and welcome back. Every week, we open up a book that's changed how thousands of people think, work, or live, and we pull out the one idea worth taking with you long after the video ends. Today's book is one you're going to want to sit with. So get comfortable and let's get into it. A locksmith is teaching a young apprentice how to pick locks, and a customer waiting nearby jokes nervously that he hopes the kid doesn't grow up to be a burglar. The locksmith's answer stops everyone in the room. He says the boy who steals a single pencil from his desk mate obviously deserves punishment, but every one of us, without a second thought, would take as many pencils as we wanted from a supply closet at work. Same object, same act, technically. And yet one feels like theft, and the other barely registers as anything at all. Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist, heard that locksmith's joke and built an entire research career chasing the question hiding inside it. Why does dishonesty feel so different depending on nothing more than where the pencil came from? That question is the whole subject of his book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And once you see his answer, you'll never look at a harmless white lie, a fudged expense report, or a stolen office pencil the same way again. Stay with me. This one is uncomfortable in exactly the useful way. A simple truth to start here's the plain truth Ariely's research keeps landing on, and it cuts directly against the story most of us tell about our own honesty. Dishonesty is almost never a cold, rational calculation of costs and benefits. It's a small, constant negotiation between wanting to gain from cheating and wanting to still think of ourselves as a fundamentally good person. The classic economic model of crime assumes people cheat when the expected benefit outweighs the expected cost of getting caught, a simple equation of risk and reward. Ariely's experiments, run over and over across thousands of participants, found something quite different. How likely someone was to get caught barely affected how much they cheated at all. What actually predicted cheating was something else entirely. How easily a person could still tell themselves a story in which they hadn't really done anything wrong. The philosopher Blaise Pascal observed centuries ago that the heart has its reasons which reason does not know. Ariely's research is, in a real sense, the modern experimental proof of exactly that idea, applied specifically to why smart, otherwise decent people cheat just a little, almost constantly, while remaining entirely convinced of their own honesty the whole time. The fudge factor. Cheating just enough to still feel honest Ariely's central concept, and the one the rest of the book builds on, is what he calls the fudge factor. The small amount of dishonesty most people allow themselves, precisely calibrated to stay just below the threshold where they'd have to admit to themselves that they'd actually cheated. In his most famous experiment, participants solved simple math problems for cash rewards. Then in one version, self-reported their own scores and destroyed the evidence before collecting payment. Given a completely unsupervised opportunity to lie for money, participants didn't lie as much as they could have. They lied a little, consistently, across thousands of trials, always inflating their score just enough to earn a bit more money, never so much that a reasonable person, including themselves, would have to call it fraud. This is the crucial finding. Nearly everyone cheats a small amount. Almost nobody cheats to the maximum extent they could get away with, and the limiting factor isn't fear of getting caught. It's the internal fudge factor. The specific point at which a small lie stops feeling like a minor rounding error and starts feeling like something that would force a person to revise their own self-image. Why cash changes everything. One of Ariely's most striking findings concerns the difference between cheating for cash directly and cheating for something one step removed from cash, tokens that get exchanged for cash moments later. When participants could cheat directly for dollars, dishonesty stayed relatively modest, matching the fudge factor pattern already described. But when the exact same opportunity to cheat produced tokens instead, tokens immediately exchangeable for the identical amount of cash just a few feet away, cheating roughly doubled. Nothing about the actual financial incentive had changed. Only the psychological distance between the dishonest act and the money itself had increased, and that distance alone was enough to loosen the fudge factor considerably. This finding has an obvious, unsettling implication for a modern economy built increasingly on tokens one or two steps removed from cash, corporate expense codes, stock options, complex financial instruments, company property that isn't quite the same as taking money from a till. Ariely's argument is that every step of psychological distance between an action and its real-world cost in cash makes the dishonest act easier to rationalize, which is precisely why financial fraud at the institutional level, several steps removed from a literal dollar bill changing hands, tends to reach a scale that a simple, direct theft from a cash register almost never does. Moral reminders. The cheapest intervention that actually works given how weak deterrence based on getting caught turned out to be. Ariely's research turned to a different lever entirely. What happens right before the moment of temptation, rather than what happens after. In one striking experiment, participants asked to recall the 10 Commandments before taking the same math test showed no cheating at all, a complete elimination of the fudge factor, regardless of whether the participant could even remember all 10 commandments accurately. The content of what was recalled mattered far less than the simple act of activating a moral frame of mind immediately before the opportunity to cheat arose. A secular version of the same experiment, having participants sign a simple honor code statement before the test, produced the identical effect, even among students at institutions with no honor code system at all. Perhaps the most practically important version of this finding concerns something as small as where a signature appears on a form. Ariely found that moving a signature line from the bottom of a document, where it traditionally sits, to the top, so that people affirm honesty before filling out the potentially self-serving information rather than after, measurably reduced dishonest reporting on everything from expense forms to insurance claims. The moral reminder works because it interrupts the fudge factor calculation before it starts, rather than trying to punish it after the fact. Creativity and cheating. An uncomfortable pairing among the book's more unexpected findings is a correlation between creativity and dishonesty. Ariely found that people who scored higher on standard measures of creative thinking also cheated more, on average, than less creative participants given the identical opportunity and incentive. The explanation isn't that creative people are less ethical. It's that cheating, in Ariely's framework, isn't simply a decision to break a rule outright. It's an exercise in constructing a story convincing enough to preserve one's own self-image while still bending the truth, and that specific skill, generating a plausible, self-serving narrative, draws on precisely the same cognitive machinery that produces creative thinking more generally. The more easily someone can imagine an alternative framing of events, the more easily they can also imagine one where their own small dishonesty doesn't really count as dishonesty at all. This finding matters practically for exactly the environments that prize creative thinking most highly: marketing, finance, entrepreneurship, precisely because the same trait that makes someone valuable for generating novel ideas also, Ariely's data suggests, quietly makes it easier for them to generate a comfortable story around their own small ethical shortcuts. Conflicts of interest. When cheating doesn't feel like cheating at all, Ariely devotes considerable attention to conflicts of interest. Situations where a person's own financial incentive quietly biases a judgment they sincerely believe remains objective, precisely because self-deception, not conscious manipulation, is doing most of the work. A financial advisor who earns a commission for recommending a specific product isn't necessarily lying to a client when they call that product the best option. Ariely's research suggests the advisor has often genuinely convinced themselves it's the best option, because the mind is remarkably skilled at reshaping evidence to match a conclusion that happens to be financially convenient, without the person experiencing this reshaping as dishonesty at all. This is precisely what makes conflicts of interest so much harder to regulate than outright fraud. The person committing it usually isn't lying in their own mind, even while their judgment has been measurably distorted by an incentive they may not have consciously factored in at all. A full example. The expense report Let's walk through how these mechanisms combine in an entirely ordinary situation: filing a company expense report, the way Ariely's research would actually predict it playing out. An employee returning from a business trip has a handful of receipts: one genuinely work-related dinner, and one dinner that was mostly personal but happened to include a 5-minute conversation about a client. Submitting the personal dinner as a legitimate business expense feels, to most people in this position, nothing at all like the theft of cash from a company safe, precisely because of the psychological distance Ariely's research identifies: a reimbursement code, an accounting system, a form, all standing between the act and an actual dollar bill changing hands directly. The fudge factor allows exactly this expense to slip through, while the same employee would never consider taking an equivalent amount of cash directly from petty cash on the office desk. Applying Ariely's findings directly, moving the honesty affirmation to the top of the expense form before the receipts are even filled in, measurably reduces exactly this kind of borderline claim, not through threat of audit, but by activating a moral frame of mind at the one moment it actually matters, before the fudge factor gets a chance to do its quiet work. Now, let's be honest, every book like this deserves an honest accounting in return, and here it is. Ariely's experiments are elegant and the effects are real, but most were conducted with modest cash stakes in controlled laboratory settings, sometimes just a few dollars per trial, and it's a genuine open question how cleanly these effects scale to genuinely high-stakes dishonesty, major financial fraud, career-defining professional decisions, where far more is on the line than a small lab payout. The book is considerably stronger as an account of small, everyday dishonesty than as a complete explanation of large-scale institutional fraud, even though it gestures toward that connection. There's a second point worth naming plainly, and one that has followed Ariely's own career in an uncomfortable, ironic way. Some of his most cited findings, including versions of the signature placement study discussed here, have faced serious replication concerns, and, in at least one striking case, allegations of fabricated underlying data from a co-author on a related study. Findings Ariely has publicly disputed responsibility for while the broader academic controversy continues to unfold. This doesn't discredit the book's central, well-replicated finding that people cheat a little rather than a lot, which holds up across many independent studies. It does mean specific individual experiments should be held with somewhat more caution than the book's confident narrative voice initially suggests. Even with those caveats, the book's core reframe remains genuinely useful. Dishonesty is rarely a cold calculation of risk against reward. It's a constant, mostly unconscious negotiation to gain a little while still believing yourself entirely honest, and understanding that negotiation, rather than just trying to punish it after the fact, turns out to be a far more effective way of actually reducing it. Asterisk asterisk, the takeaway asterisk asterisk, notice how the fudge factor works in your own life. The small dishonesties that never feel like real dishonesty because they stay just below the threshold of what would force you to revise your own self-image. Watch for psychological distance, tokens instead of cash, codes instead of dollars. Anywhere that distance exists is exactly where small cheating quietly grows larger without ever feeling like it has. Use moral reminders deliberately. A signature, an honest statement placed before temptation rather than after it, because that timing alone measurably changes behavior. And when you notice a financial or personal incentive sitting near a judgment you're making, ask honestly whether that incentive might be quietly reshaping what you've convinced yourself is simply the objective truth. The locksmith's joke was funnier than he probably realized. Every one of us is the boy with the pencils from the supply closet in some small corner of our lives, entirely convinced we're one of the honest ones. Ariely's research doesn't say we're wrong to think that. It says the honest ones and the small cheaters were never actually two different groups of people to begin with.